much in line with previous literature. We do find expected effects for 2 of the crimes for GDP per capita, and we find fairly consistent effects, and even here's the exception that proves the rule, for incarceration. As the prisons expanded dramatically during the 1990s, that expansion was related to year-to-year reductions in crime. Now, we can quarrel about whether prison expansion is a cost-efficient or humane way of controlling crime, but I think there's no longer much doubt on the part of those of us who study such things that the massive run-up in imprisonment in the United States over the last couple of decades has reduced crime, at least in the short run. And the one crime for which we don't find an important imprisonment effect is larceny. And that's because larcenists, shoplifters, have a very low imprisonment risk. So insofar as imprisonment has any deterrent effect, it shouldn't deter larcenists very much. If it has a so-called incapacitation effect, meaning that when you're in prison, you can't do the crime, you're not going to incapacitate that many larcenists because their imprisonment risk is relatively low. You saw that crime decline during the 90s, a very impressive crime decline. Roughly speaking, homicide, robbery, burglary rates declined by half during the decade of the 1990s. What we wanted to do in this research is just ask the question, how much do these 2 economic indicators, as well as the imprisonment rate, how much of the how much of the crime rate decline during the 90s could be attributed to those factors? And from our models, we estimated that the index of consumer sentiment explained anywhere from 1/3, a little less than 1/3, to perhaps even half of the crime reduction of the 90s. GDP per capita, that other economic indicator, explained in a couple of cases an appreciable additional amount of the crime rate decline, and imprisonment had a non-trivial effect on crime rate declines during the 90s as well. And so the next time you read, and we see this pretty frequently, quote, "No one knows," or "we don't know," what the factors were that were responsible for crime rate changes during the 1990s. We certainly don't, our knowledge isn't perfect. But we know a lot more now than we did even 5 years ago about some of the important factors in that research. That's property crime, and I suggested that the economy also influences violent crime. And I think the influence is indirect by and large, and it's indirect through the effect of the economy on property crime, and in turn the effect of property crime on violent crime. Property, when those underground markets that I mentioned earlier begin to expand, they heat up, they become more active. That's reflected in increased property crime rates. But think about what's happening in those so-called stateless social locations. They're stateless in the sense that when conflicts emerge between buyers and sellers, or competitive conflicts emerge between sellers, or when street robbers prey on people in those markets, those conflicts, even the victimizations associated with street robbery, cannot be taken to the police because everybody's engaged in illegal activity. And so the police are more or less out of the picture. There's no Better Business Bureau to complain to if you feel like you've been ripped off when you attempted to purchase stolen merchandise. Let me tell you a brief anecdote from my own observations in St. Louis. There's a very active underground market on Union Avenue in St. Louis that gets very busy during the warmer months on Saturdays. Card tables are set out on the corner, and you've seen this in other places. All kinds of goods are available. Not all of them stolen by any means. A lot of them just knockoff goods. Some stolen goods as well. In any event, I saw a woman buy a package of 6 tube socks. Excuse me, you've seen these packages. She paid $1 for the package. That's not bad for 6 pairs of socks. Within 5 minutes, she had walked away. She came back to complain, she turned the package over, and the water stains clearly had ruined at least 3, probably 4 pairs of the socks. And the package was open in the back and had tape on it. So she wanted her money back. And the guy told her to go to hell. He wasn't going to get her money back. Well, what was she to do then? There was no Better Business Bureau to complain to, no store manager to go to. Certainly invoking the police is unlikely in this case, because she has to explain why she's in the process of receiving even a paltry amount, but receiving stolen goods. She's out to lunch. Now, what she might have done is waited until this guy got off, he walked around the corner and stolen her money back, or assaulted her. And in fact, some conflicts in underground markets are settled in quite that fashion, precisely because formal means of dispute resolution tend to be unavailable. Violence in those contexts becomes a relatively potent enforcement mechanism. As the underground markets heat up during economic downturns, we should expect to see not only more property crime, but also more violent crime associated with the buying and selling and marketing of stolen goods, as well as other reasons. So what I'm suggesting is that property crime mediates the relationship between changes in economic conditions and violent crime. The economy turns down, property crime rates turn up, and as a consequence, so do violent crime rates. The economy improves, property crime rates come down, and so do violent crime rates. That's the argument. Here I noted earlier that property crime and violent crime trends closely correspond to one another in the United States, and they certainly do. There's a very, very strong correlation between changes in homicide, represented by the blue line here, and changes in what I'm calling acquisitive crime, which is an index including robbery, burglary, and motor vehicle theft. When acquisitive crime goes up, homicide tends to go up. When acquisitive crime comes down, homicide tends to turn down. That's the overall relationship between acquisitive crime and homicide. What if, though, we were interested in just the year-to-year changes, right? So instead now of putting on the graph the levels of each crime each year, what I'm now going to show you is the difference between crime this year and crime the previous year. Those will be the values that will be